This is the More to the Story podcast with Dr. Andy Miller.
We hope you guys enjoyed today's conversation.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming along to the podcast today. It's a real blessing to have you here. Thanks for taking time. If you got this because somebody shared it, thanks to those who shared. It means a lot to me when you can take time to review this podcast on Apple's podcast, or if you leave a comment on YouTube. When people share this podcast via social media, what happens is I can generally trace the fact that oh, so-and-so found out about this because I know somebody in their circle of influence shared it. So if you enjoy what you've been hearing on the More to the Story podcast, it'd mean a lot to me if you'd share it with people. And one thing we want to make sure you know about is that we're offering a free 4-page PDF document that's a tool for preachers and teachers to use to move from exegeting scripture to then proclaiming it in a creative way. So I think you'll find it helpful. It's something that I've used in my classes that has helped my students be able to become better preachers and teachers, and I want to share it with you. So you can get that by going to my website, Andy Miller III, that's Andy Miller III.com, and you can sign up for my email list. And I send 2 to 3 emails a month that shares not just podcast content, but other things that I've come upon that I think the listeners of my podcast would be interested in. So thanks so much for coming along for this. Today, I have Major Jason Swain on the podcast, and you're going to find out a lot about him and his passion for history, as he's written a new book on the history of the start of the Salvation Army in the United States. So I think you'll find this really interesting. My thanks to my sponsors who have supported me through this podcast, Bill Roberts, WPO Development, and Keith Waters, and an anonymous donor who helped make this happen. Thanks so much for checking out the More to the Story podcast. God bless you. Welcome to the More to the Story podcast. I'm glad you've come along. Today is an exciting episode because I have my friend on, Major Jason Swain. Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, so glad to be here, Andy.
Now, you have a new book out, and I'm holding up in front of the screen for those who are watching on YouTube. Under Two Flags, The Rise, Rebellion, and Rebuilding of the Salvation Army in America, 1870 to 1913. And this has just been published through Crest Books, which is the publication arm of National Headquarters of the Salvation Army. So I'm fascinated by this. Now, it's a little book. And it's it wouldn't take you too long to get through it, but I'm fascinated by the subject, by the name. I want to talk through it as best I can with you. But the best thing you could probably do is go online or order a copy yourself. Now, today, we have a special thing happening that we have 5 copies that are available for free. I do this every so often. Thankfully, when publishers and authors are able to help me with this. If you share a link to this on your social media, to this conversation, or if you make a comment in YouTube, or the final way you could, if you join my email list at andymillerthird.com, that's andymillerii.com, there's a little tab where you can go and you can join my email list. So when this podcast comes out for 2 weeks after it, you can enter into the contest and you can win a copy of Under Two Flags. So Jason, as we get started here, I wanted to just curious, what is it that led you to want to write this book?
A couple of things. I always was fascinated by the early days of the Salvation Army. And when I was stationed at the training college in Atlanta, I was assigned to teach Salvation Army history. And we always go through those early British days of the Salvation Army. And then we hit America and we go forward and we kind of stay in America because that's where we are.
Yeah.
And this maybe 10-year period, 1880 to 1890, was just fascinating. All these things happen here in America that don't happen anywhere else in the world. And then you get into a little bit more research about it and you find out that, the official story is not the real story. There's actually some things that happen.
More to the story?
There's more to the story. And that's why the book starts at 1870 and not 1880, which is the official welcome of the Salvation Army into America. There's actually 10 years of things that happened beforehand. And then there's things that happen afterward that kind of end and culminate in 1913. It stops there. The problems kind of stop there. But actually and truthfully, the end really comes in 1976, and that's at the end of the book, and you'll have to read it to find out why I say that.
Okay. Well, this is fascinating. And philosophically, I think there's something I want to hit before we even get into the content, you said something interesting, not happening anywhere else in the world. And I think there is something about how the Salvation Army actualizes its mission in a given context. So we take this broad approach to reality, like how the world operates, facilitate and live out a mission. But then it contextualizes itself. And there are aspects of American society that don't comport well with the structure of the Army. And so, like, I think there's probably some of that comes to the forefront here in your discussion. Now, before we get into the content of the book a little bit more, like, you currently serve as, you lead the Salvation Army's work in northeastern Kentucky. Isn't that right? In Ashland is where you're based, but you serve a huge area. Tell us quickly about that.
It's 11 counties in the northeast of Kentucky, based in the city of Ashland, which is the largest city actually in the region. It's very mountainous, Appalachia, and the Corps has been here for 120 years or so.
Wow.
And you actually can go visit all the sites where the Army rented or built. And we actually were just down the street for almost 70 years in one building. And then they moved into this current building in 1996. And they've had their ups and downs, as all corps do. But yeah, we serve this entire area. Total population, probably around the 100,000 when you take all 11 counties. Right. But most of it's rural, out in the country, and that kind of thing.
It's a unique environment, but yet because of its geographic location, kind of on the eastern side of the country, like the Salvation Army was there early, but it's I think if you were able to go through even just the history of Ashland, you'd find some unique expressions of what happened in the Army. And also, 11 counties, that's a huge geographical footprint. So there's a lot of ground to cover there. Now, you were able to write this book in part because you had a literary appointment, which is incredibly unique. So you served, you helped publish national publications at The War Cry, Young Salvationist, or Peer, and then the Crest Books, right? Was that part of what enabled you to be able to do this project?
Yeah, part of it was that I was there at National Headquarters and had access one floor down or two floors down to the archives. So it was easy to go downstairs and spend a half a day or an hour or a full. I did a couple of full days and look through what they had there, look at old war cries, look at books that I don't own that were published many, many years ago that aren't really well known today. One particular one that is really was a great resource was the 1950s history of the Salvation Army in the United States by Harold Wisby.
Yes.
Wisby, Soldiers Without Swords, which is Harold Herbert Wisby, which is a great resource because that's still within that, there were people still alive who remembered the old days and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of information in that book, and that book is featured prominently also in Dr. McKinley's Marching to Glory, History of the Salvation Army book. And so those two were kind of my base books, and then filled in by others just for little bits and pieces and that were found in other books. So those two were great to have. And actually, while I was at National, I was able to pick up a Wisby book that someone was giving away.
Yeah.
So
you can find them sitting around Salvation Army buildings every now and then. I always enjoy going to churches or Salvation Armies and finding their, it might be one bookshelf, but there's always interesting things there that have been collected through the years.
Yeah, the National Archives got rid of most of their library books, and so that was one great. I got a whole bunch back here on the shelf of things I received, but also while I was at the training college, occasionally retired officers would bring their entire collection in as they were downsizing, in life, and I'd always get a call from the librarian and say, "We got all these books. You want to come look?" Yes. Yeah. And I picked up some great older, no longer published books. Yeah. In my collection. So I was able to. I had the time. We were also, pandemic wise, we were kind of shut down, or at least not in the office. And so I had some time on my hands to kind of go through some things. And then I started going back to headquarters, and there were just a few of us there every day. So it was real quiet, and really a great atmosphere for writing. And then my boss, Tim Foley, Lieutenant Colonel Tim Foley, was editor in chief, and he really encouraged me. He said, just start something, and if something comes out of it. And I got about the first chapter done, and I sent it around to several people and said, "What do you think? It's one chapter. What do you think?" And I got such great encouragement to go ahead and just write the rest. And it changed. My original thought was just to write about the Thomas More affair.
Right.
But that led to so many other things. And that weird 20 or 30 year period of the early days of the Army in America.
Yeah. Now, let me jump in. I want to highlight you sometime the archives, and you and I saw each other there while I was spending some time in the archives. And just our thanks to Susan Mitchum. You'll notice many books, academic books, popular level books, oftentimes in the acknowledgement, you'll see her name, and you'll see archivists all around the world who have done a great job. So like she did that and really opening the door for you and me on many fronts. So what I want to highlight, like my kind of appraise, I think you've done a great job in this book, Jason. And it's not necessarily like academic research, and that's okay. And I liken it to one of the most successful books that has been printed in Salvation Army literature in the last 20 years. And that's General John Larson's 1929, The Constitutional Crisis That Shaped the Salvation Army. In that you went to the secondary sources like Wisby, like McKinley, and then some of your own research too. I'm not saying there's not any of that there, but it's not like a theological analysis. This is just trying to tell a story well so that people can get it. And I think you've done a great job, because a lot of times people don't have time to go or find Wisby or to go through McKinley, and we could keep going. Or like Nickel, you go through Nickel, you go through various Booth's writings, and you assimilate all that and you tell a really compelling story, because a lot of times, most of the time, I'd say, people don't know this. People don't know what happened in this time period. So tell us, Jason, what is it? What are these controversies? What is it, this rebellion that happened? What is that people don't know?
I think the main point, and I've thought about this since writing it, and the question boils down to who owns the Salvation Army?
Right.
That's really what it really comes down to. And you get two opposing sides, one being the Booth family, but General Booth himself, William Booth himself, and him working under British common law. That's the first part.
Okay.
Second part is we now are across the world, which is not too much of a different thing at that time from British common law, but we have this other thing called the United States of America, and their laws are not the British laws. They're based on it, but they're not the same.
Right.
And so you get into this idea of, well, who owns everything? Who owns the building? Who owns the songbooks? Who owns this? Who can do this? Who can do that? Who can't do this? Now, that sounds kind of silly today to ask that, but in the 1880s, that was a very important question. Yes. Who owns the stuff or has the right to own the stuff? And that's really what it really boils down to. The Salvation Army came to America and had some issues early on about signing things and owning things and renting things, all these things that were at the very beginning. And it became very clear very early that what we needed to do was form a corporation.
Yeah.
And that's really where the crux of this whole thing started. But across the ocean, William Booth did not understand that and really couldn't even conceptualize that idea. How could we incorporate? He was against it totally. Now, it does happen eventually. It does happen in the 1880s, but then it happens officially again in the 1890s. And that's where we still are today. And those corporations all still exist.
Yeah.
But
so this is really interesting that you bring that up at the beginning. And actually, that's the analysis, I think, as the implications of the historical facts that you described. Who owns it? Okay, I interrupted you a little bit there.
Oh, no. So that's the crux of it.
Yeah.
The other thing is we hadn't quite figured out the whole massive expansion of the Salvation Army that happened in those times. When the Christian mission became the Salvation Army, everybody worth their salt will tell you that we had explosive growth. We were growing before, but when the name changed, we exploded. That was the nexus of that, and it started, and we became the Salvation Army. And every day, were there new orders, there were new rules, or new regulations. This is that old cliche, building the ship at sea. We were doing that, and that was the way it was. We were not ready to expand to France, to Australia, to America, to Canada, but we did it anyway. It just happened naturally, and it kind of got to the point where, again, the international headquarters, with William Booth being the general in charge of all, and Bramwell being the chief of the staff, Railton being the secretary, they were literally making this up on the fly. And so a lot of these things that happened, especially in America, just kind of threw them a little bit because they had never had this experience before.
Right.
We also got to remember the Salvation Army did not just blow up out of the ground and we're everywhere like we are today. I mean, in 1879, I mean, we had Philadelphia. We had one place in Philadelphia. That's it. And by the time Railton shows up in 1880, there's 3 corps in Philadelphia, and that's it. Like there's just 3 small areas, 3 small chapel corps centers in Philadelphia. That's it. And even when he leaves a year later, there's still only New York, a couple in New Jersey, and there's a couple in Philadelphia. So it's not a huge thing. Now, by the 1884, it's moved very far west, very rapidly. It's moved south and west. It's all the way out to St. Louis again, and all through Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Chicago, all those places. And then, strangely enough, spontaneously out on the West Coast,
right,
the Salvation Army has no connection back to the East Coast. It starts on its own. It has its own problems, and eventually gets folded in during kind of the crisis days. But that's the kind of the strange things that happen. And we've got to always remember that the Army was brand new.
Right.
When Eliza Shirley shows up, she doesn't even have a uniform because it hadn't been invented yet.
Right. It's anachronistic for us to jump back and assume that there's this like fully developed version of a denomination or movement, organization that just wasn't around. And you highlight too, James Jeremy, him coming in earlier than that, even ahead of Eliza Shirley. So then you have Eliza Shirley and her family, and the Shirley family, and the kind of way they're expressing. Remember, this is 1879, the name change, and not just the name change, the organizational change, like the structural change that happened to put William Booth as the autocratic leader. That change, and many people would assume and say that that's a part of why we grew so expansively. But that just 1 year later, and just 2 years later, before George Scott Railton comes with the famous Hallelujah Lassies to New York City. So, okay, so we're in this period where this is like, it's not exactly clear, and there's a way that it's not expansive. It's not like, as we say today, serving in every zip code in the United States. But where does Thomas More enter into this, and what is it that happens with Thomas More?
Thomas More was a businessman from Britain, and he actually came to America after the Civil War, American Civil War, so 1865, 66, 67, somewhere in there. He comes to America, travels the country. We're not quite sure what business he was in. It's not really related in anything what he was in, but he was some kind of businessman, and he did come to America. He went back to Britain, came back to America. So all in all, he had served here for 11 years in this business aspect. And then he goes back to London, and he meets the Salvation Army. Brand new, it just had changed its name. And he is enraptured by this whole thing. He joins the Salvation Army. And because he had this business background, which was very common in those days, he was made what they called a divisional officer. we can't quite equate it to divisional commander today,
right,
which is what we currently have. But it's kind of all the DHQ staff wrapped into one, because they didn't have large headquarters staffs back then. So he was the divisional officer. He served in the south of London. He was in charge of all the core centers in the south of London. And that's where he was in 1880. Railton comes in 1880, and by 1881, he's been recalled back. The Army is growing so fast, Booth needs his second in command or his third in command to come and help. And so he does, reluctantly. And they look at the pool of officers in Britain, because there were none in America.
right.
A pool of officers in Britain, and who has experience, who has some knowledge. Wait a minute. Moore has been to America. He knows the country. Let's send him. And so Thomas More comes and makes some changes early on that benefit the Army. And he's still here in 1884. He's still here. He's leading there. He's made some changes. The Army has, in 3 or 4 years, it's grown expansively. When he shows up, there's 12 corps, 12 centers. By the time of 1884, there's 125, I think is the number. So we go from 12 to 125 in 3 years, 4 years. And he sees very clearly the problems with the Army in America. This whole idea of we need to be incorporated, as we spoke of already, that the corporation needs to run the things, and then we can report back to London. He sees that very clearly, and he sends delegations to London. He writes telegrams, writes letters. Here's the problem. You can't, you, General Booth, cannot own property in the United States, in every state. And he
right.
could in some states, not in every state. You are a foreign national. You're a subject of the British Empire. You cannot own property all over the country. So this is our problem. Who owns the Salvation Army?
Right.
And so the idea is that if we incorporate the corporation, the Salvation Army, Incorporated, would own everything, and that we'd have a board of directors, and it'd be made up of officers and staff, and they would just govern the legal side of it, not the ecclesiastical side, not the the church growth side. It's just the legal side and business, and that was really the crux of it. And so he gets so frustrated that by 1884, he copyrights everything that he could. He incorporates everything that he could, and basically breaks away in this is the rebellion part, breaks away from London and takes most of the corps with him. Mm-hmm. In the 80 percentile range, 80-90% range. They all sign on to this. Now, by this time, all those officers have been trained in America. They kind of understood more. William Booth was just this ethereal name that appeared in the war cry every once in a while. He had never been to America yet.
Right.
He was just the general. He was across the sea, and he occasionally wrote a thing that appeared in the war cry, and that was it. Like, no one knew who he was.
Right.
And there was no loyalty to him per se.
So Moore sets up his own, the Salvation Army of America. And when he does this, he makes himself the general of the Salvation Army and of America. And what else does he do that's different? So Thomas More creates the Salvation Army of America. He makes himself the general. Jason, could you tell me what is it that he does differently besides like not submitting to the leadership of the general? I mean, that's the main thing. What is it that he does differently when he creates the Salvation Army of America?
One of the first things he did was he copyrighted all the symbology. So he copyrighted the war cry. He copyrighted the flag. He copyrighted the crest. Which was strange. He just does it. And so that's the first thing he does. He moves the headquarters. Now, he had done this already, but he kind of doubled down. He moves headquarters from Philadelphia to Brooklyn. Not New York City. And back then, Brooklyn was a separate city from New York City. So he moves to Brooklyn, and then he starts just kind of making very odd decisions, not just because he was had the title general doesn't mean he was a leader. And so he starts, and the other thing he does is, because they're incorporated, he sets up basically a board of directors. And when they write into the corporate documentation, he basically says that everything is subject to the board of directors, not himself. So he is not autocratic like William Booth. He is more a leadership by committee kind of thing.
Right.
This will end up in about 2 years to come around and bite him, because when the bad decisions are made, the board basically terminates him as the general. And then we go through the next couple of years of back and forth, and what are we going to do? And it eventually collapses on itself. Almost immediately, people realized this was a bad decision. I'm literally, like, the day it happened, there were people like, maybe this should not have happened this way. It was all passion and emotion, and there were several leaders in the Salvation Army who realized this and tried their best to reconcile. It took another 5 years.
Right. So one of the other things that I always find interesting is that in the Moore Army, so to speak, they practiced the sacraments, and they had a statement about the church, the understanding of the church. That obviously felt like that was lacking. But let's just jump ahead, because I love to get to Ballington too, if we have time. So all this happens. They immediately realize there's a problem. There is this heroic work, I believe, that happens. And I like how you highlight it too, of Holtz. And he kind of helps lead a group back. So tell us about how this comes back together, like how things are rebuilt, and like what's going on in that next phase.
So the Salvation Army International. Now you have to start adding these tags to it, because you get, by this time, you have 3 or 4 different Salvation Armies, and they get confusing. So we have, in America, we have the Salvation Army, we'll say International. That's the Salvation Army that's still around, which I belong to today. Then you have the Salvation Army of America. That's the Moore group. We'll just call them the Moore Army for now.
Okay.
Later on, you're going to have the American Salvation Army, which is another group. And then you got several other copycats that show up from time to time. So the Salvation Army International sends the next national commander, Frank Smith. Now, Frank Smith has been told, you go to America and solve the problem. Fine. Frank Smith comes to America and puts headquarters in New York, and just starts publishing a war cry. And he starts off, but he believes, because this is what he has been told, but also what he believes, that all who left are traitors. And that's a strong word, but that's what he uses. And so Richard Holtz met the Salvation Army in Buffalo, New York, was quickly promoted. He was an excellent officer. He was in charge of upstate New York, based up in Albany. And he was one of the ones who almost immediately realized this was problematic. So when Frank Smith shows up, Holtz leads the delegation into New York. They show up at headquarters and said, we're here to talk to Frank Smith, the national commander. And they are rebuffed. They are literally thrown out of the building and called traitors and rebellious scum, pretty much, and do not come back. Holtz is saddened by this, but he says, okay, I'll bide my time. And off he goes. Now, Frank Smith did some amazing things. And why the book is called what it is because it's Frank Smith who says, we are the true Salvation Army, and we are the true Salvation Army in America. Just a slight change there.
Right.
And therefore, we will now start carrying on our marches, parades, and in our halls, the American flag along with the Salvation Army flag. So we will now serve under 2 flags.
There you go.
And that's the title of the book. So it's Frank Smith who does that. And that's kind of odd, because we think of the Moore Army, of the Salvation Army of America, they would be the more patriotic, but that's not the case. It's the Salvation Army International who starts this trend, and it remains so today. In every Salvation Army hall and every Salvation Army chapel, on our marches, if we do those anymore, and anything that we do, they're always together. The cover of the book is Evangeline Booth when she shows up as national commander in 1904. You see she's carrying both flags, and you see the little, on the Army flag, you see the little American flag tacked in the corner. That was another thing that was kind of unique to America in those days. So Frank Smith comes along, calls them out. Holtz bides his time. Now, during this whole time, this is the middle 1880s, individual corps are returning to the Salvation Army. They're leaving the Moore Army one by one, slowly. Officers are either resigning, and the people, but there's also, and I mentioned this in the book, people have no clue what's going on. The people, the soldiers, right. Even some officers out west have no clue what's going on. They're reading about these things, and they just have no clue. And odd things happen. You get controversial telegrams that go back and forth. And a telegram goes out one day that says Thomas Moore is no longer the general of the Salvation Army of America. And then Moore sends a comment, says, disregard that last one. Yep, I'm still in charge. There's like 4 in a day. I could imagine a poor officer trying to do their work in 1885, 86, and they're getting these telegrams every couple of hours. Today it'd be like getting an email every 5 seconds. I mean, you know, back and forth. I'm sure they were just flabbergasted. So during that, Frank Smith finally is recalled back to London. He has some work to do that he's going to do. And finally, the right man is sent. And that is the general's second son, Ballington Booth, and his wife, Maud Charlesworth, who come. They're co-national commanders. And they will stay here for 10 years. They will live in America the rest of their lives, but they will stay as national commanders for 10 years. They are the ones who start the ball rolling. He meets with Holtz, and they said, we're not sure how this is going to pan out, but let's work towards it. And a couple of years later, they create this big reconciliation day. Strangely enough, it happens in Saratoga, New York, not in New York City, but a lot of the Corps at that time were up in the northeast of the country, in New England, New York, Pennsylvania, those kind of places. And so that was considered the hotbed of this rebellion. So we're going to do it up there. They have a big parade. They all march into the hall. You could still go to that city hall. You actually go in up the stairs into the auditoriums on the second floor. And the army marches, the Salvation Army marches in. And then the others come in, they march in to applause and singing. And there's just tears, and there's great reconciliation that happens on that night. But not everybody's there. There's a very small group of officers who are just still not reconciled to this whole thing. And they start the American Salvation Army. Based in Saratoga, of all places where this all just happened. It's based in Saratoga by a guy by the name of William Grattan. And William Grattan and about 12 others start this American Salvation Army. And then they last about 10 years, and then they fold. He sends a letter out that says, we have no basis, we have no growth, we have no money, we're folding. And William Grattan goes away, does not enter the story until back about 1904 or 05. He sends a very large packet of documents to Evangeline Booth. And he says, I have been remiss. I should have done this a long time ago. Here is the charter and all the documents for the American Salvation Army. As the only member still remaining of the American Salvation Army, I have given you the authority to do that with what you will. So technically, until that is absorbed into the Salvation Army International, General Evangeline Booth was the general of the American Salvation Army for a couple of years.
Wow.
It's because she had it all. Now, that whole pile of documents are gone. Like no one knows what happened to him. There's no record of them other than we have this letter. We have the cover letter that's from William Grattan. And he
so
goes
it's interesting. Like you have, so this group, okay. Could you talk about the group that's still in like operation today in the DC area?
Oh yeah.
American Rescue Workers.
Yeah. So, well, that's another part of the story. So in the 1890s, well, I have to go back. There's a lot more to this. So Moore Lee is thrown out of the Salvation Army of America,
right?
And the board of directors can't find someone to replace him. So they ask several people, and they all say no. And they finally get to Holtz. Back why Holtz is important. And Holtz says, "I will not be the general, but I will take on the mantle of commander." And so you see documents from it. It says Colonel Richard Holtz, commander. It doesn't say general, it just says commander. When Moore goes off to New England, and he starts a group called the Crusaders for Christ. And within a year or two, he's actually thrown out of that group as well. And then he he is a traveling evangelist from that point on until he ends up in Kansas. And there is where he passes on. The Crusaders for Christ decide to change their name back to the Salvation Army of America. So here we go again. We have the Salvation Army International, we have the American Salvation Army, and we have the Salvation Army of America. So we have all these at this one time, and they stay the Salvation Army of America until that's why it ends in 1913. They stay that until the Salvation Army finally gets tired of it and sues them. It takes a couple of years, but the Salvation Army wins, and they are under orders to change their name, change their symbols, change their everything. They have to change. They become the American Rescue Workers, and the American Rescue Workers for about 50 years grew and kind of did their thing, and they did their thing. We did ours. They were similar, but not the same. And just over the years, they have slowly gone away. They used to have 16 places in operation, and then there were 10, and then there were 4, and now there's 3.
Okay.
They've dropped all their military jargon and terminology. They've pretty much they will not be much longer in operation.
But
sadly.
even just a few years ago, they were still wearing uniforms. Kind of thought of themselves as a church. It was like finding this like cousin that you never knew about when you like look them up.
Yeah, their doctrines are almost word for word. They had colonels and captains, and they didn't have a seminary. You were taught kind of in the field, you kind of thing. And they had at one time they had places all over, and their general, they did have the general for life kind of thing. And he finally retired, a guy by the name of Claude Aston, and Claude finally retired and turned it over to his son, Sean, who right after that, they dropped all their uniforms and everything. And if you look it up today, you'll see a picture of Sean. He's just wearing a polo shirt with their logo. And he's not the general. He's just executive director, but they're down.
So this is so interesting. Like what's happened. We probably don't have too long to talk about Bellington, but I want to make another observation of something that a way this even impacted my life. The stuff with Moore, that you have not until 1976, there's some changes that come about. Now, if you still might even see remnants of it around, but for instance, I was looking for some documents just yesterday, and I found my dedication document, that dedication slip, whatever you call it, like certificate. That's it. And as I'm looking at it, I was born in 1980, so I was dedicated in 1980, but there must have still been enough around that the old days in the United States, the Salvation Army had a different crest. There would be an eagle on top of the crest representing America. Jason, you want to tell us why that is?
Yeah, that goes from the copyright of 1884. Moore copyrighted the crest and the shield, everything. And even our flag, if you notice, United States flags are different than British or other flags. It's just the star is different.
Yeah.
It all comes back to that copyright. Now we could go back to the old one, but we're used to that one. And so the crest had to change as well. And so the idea was, well, we don't have to change everything, just one thing to make it our own. So the Salvation Army in America changed it to an eagle on top. From Isaiah 41, they will mount up with wings of eagles is what it meant. But the Americans took it as very patriotic.
Yeah.
We have this. So you see old pictures, you always can point out the American Salvationists. They've got that eagle on the top of their crest. And that is in place. Even when I was a kid, there were retired officers who still had that eagle on the top. Stained glass windows in a lot of buildings. Certificates were still around. And even when I worked for the Salvation Army before I went to training in the 90s, we were still dealing with the old buildings that had the eagle on the outside in some way. And there was actually a program to get that changed in the 90s. So we're talking 20 years after the fact. Wow. But it's still around. I have pins. I have all kinds of things that have that eagle on it. 1976, the commissioners in the United States found out that the copyright had lapsed and was not renewable by anybody. So they quickly grabbed it up, copyrighted it, and we went back to the crown crest, and that's the way it probably will.
Once again, under Britain, we find ourselves.
Well,
I know it's more spiritual than that, but it's just like, it's interesting to me, like even just the symbolism of it. When you go to other countries that were British colonies, you see some very similar logos and similar imagery that's used. So,
yeah. So we were always a little unique. We still are in some ways. The only thing that's really remained from that time period is our flags.
Yeah.
You go to any other country in the world, the national flag might be in the hall, but 90% of the time it won't be. I've watched Salvation Army marches from all over the world. It's always just the Army flag.
Right.
But if you see one in America, it's both.
You can go back to podcasts that I've done with my brother, Dr. Nathan Miller, where he makes this a subject of his dissertation, where he talks about music and the way music incorporates and facilitates nationalism. And he has a lot to say about the use of the flag. So you can, and even sociologically, what happens with that. But go back to my podcast. You can find it at my website for that. Again, I'm with my friend, Major, I almost said Captain Jason Swain, and who serves in Ashland, Kentucky. All right, we don't have too much longer, but I would really love for you. Can you give us like a short version of then what happens with Ballington? So we have Ballington who comes in, he helps restore the groups in the 1880s. Then we have this kind of like unified front, this charismatic leader, he and his wife Maud. But obviously they come into similar trouble. This is a structural issue, and that's what Moore confronted as well. That was Moore's challenge. But what was that challenge, and then how did that get resolved?
Quickly, Ballington comes in, and he is given broad powers to do whatever needs to be done. They reconcile in 1889, and all is well. They build a brand new, beautiful headquarters building on 14th Street in New York building. It even had a cannon on the top that they fired at noon. I would love to have been there when that first happened. They rebuild, and the Army is growing, and William Booth comes finally for his first visit. It doesn't go that well. William Booth by this time was kind of cranky and crabby kind of guy. He was older, and anyway, it doesn't go well. And there's ideas that America has gotten to use Booth's phrase, Yankee Doodleism has infected the Army in America. But he loves it. He speaks to capacity crowds everywhere he goes, and it boils down to a family squabble. Really, there are some structural issues that they still dealt with, but there was really down to William Booth, Bramwell Booth, his son, and Ballington all had family squabbles, as the whole family does. And it gets to a head in 1896. They've been there 10 years by that point. But they want to stay. They see the possibilities and that kind of thing. They become American citizens. They live in New Jersey. They're and so they almost lead a second rebellion away from the Salvation Army International. But there are so many people who remembered the first one, because it was only 10 years previous, that the officers want nothing to do with it.
Right.
And they finally leave. William Booth comes for one more visit, and this happens later on, and it's a great quote. It says they meet at a hotel. No one knows what the meeting was about, but it's, we met, we prayed, and we parted forever. That's the phrase,
Yeah.
and that's the way it was. Ballington goes on to form another group called the Volunteers of America, still around. And he is their first general, and will be so until he passes on in the 1940s. His Maud will take over, and then their son will take over. And then they change their structure a little bit. They drop all their military stuff early on in the 50s. And they're around, they still grow, they do what they do. And they celebrate those early days. And you'll see pictures of them if you even look on the Volunteers of America website. You'll see pictures you can notice their crests on their, and they say they came from the Salvation Army.
Yeah.
So there are American cousins.
There you go.
And they do what they do, and but they dropped a lot of their ecclesiastical stuff pretty early on, and they're just now a nonprofit.
Right, and their original name was the American Salvation Army. Is that right?
No, they were always the Volunteers of America.
Didn't they? I thought they started. Maybe I have this. I thought they had a different title, and then there was a lawsuit. But anyhow, still, like, they had these concepts, and now Alan Satterley has a couple of articles that were really interesting. I think you know about him, where he looks at like what's happening at these groups now, and he sees extremes that we'd want to avoid. And I thought that was decades ago that he wrote this. So you have he says we don't want to be just like the Volunteers of America that become just a charity, but we also don't want to be just the rescue workers, American rescue workers either, where they just kind of fold away into obscurity. What do you think of that? Like those comparisons, like as far as identity today for the denomination?
Yeah, it's fascinating that having all the advantages in 1884, the Salvation Army of America should have just cleaned up and still been here today. Yet within 5 years, they're gone. All the growth that happened in the American rescue workers, here we are 100 years later, and they're not even, I can't even say they're a shadow of themselves. There's three places left.
Yeah.
They're pretty much gone. Volunteers of America are still around, but they dropped all of their the religious stuff, and they're just a charity that operates around the country here and there, but they're not seeing much growth. At least they're not opening new offices. What they have is what they have.
Yeah.
And others like that. There was a progressive Salvation Army in the 1890s. They barely lasted 10 years. The American Salvation Army, lasted for a little while, and they folded. They didn't have the background. So it's interesting to me that the Salvation Army International, even though coming in at that disadvantage in 1884, is what it is today in America and around the world. Call that spiritual blessing, God's hand on us, possible, that's true, or just that we stuck to our guns. We stayed within our structure, and we go from there. I was speaking to someone recently, and we were talking about the Salvation Army and the mission. And I said, listen, the mission's never changed. The methods have changed drastically. Even in my time as an officer, the methods have changed, but the mission remains the same. And it was the same in 1880. It was the same in 1890, and all the way through. The times have changed, and our methods have changed, and the Army has changed a great deal. But we still serve people in the lowest stratas of society, all the way up to the multimillionaire. It doesn't matter to us where you come from. We serve without discrimination.
Yeah, it's beautiful. There's, I've been one who's talked about the challenge that we have with understanding our identity and wondering if there might be a time where I said just recently it's either accountability or division. And I think that this is like the reason I say that is not because I'm suggesting that the corporation changes, but what makes up a group, an entity? Is it only based upon the things that we do? Or how we're incorporated, or is it what we believe? And I think that's where I think that's what would make any change that would happen my desire would be that there wouldn't be any change. I think it'd be very, very hard corporately to make that happen. But at the same time, I think that requires leadership to institute accountability. Like, so if you just decided, you know what, I'm going to, I'm going to have the Salvation Army in Ashland not believe in the Trinity anymore. Well, that's moving away from the mission. And I think that's the heart of what I've been saying. And the contemporary application is when you move away from the mission, that's where we get in trouble.
Yeah. My one critique would be that we have got to stop. Oh, I might get in trouble for this. We've got to stop trying to be like other churches. That's where we've gotten into a lot of trouble. I'm not talking doctrinally, and I'm not talking just we need to be who we are. And I see so many people saying, "Oh yeah, but they got 1,000 people and they do all this stuff and they do this and they do that." And I'm like, okay, that's them. Why do we want to be like them? Other than, is it just about numbers? Let's, and so there are people like, well, we got to drop all the uniforms and drop all the terminology. And I'm like, nope, we need to go the other way, and go back to how we used to talk about things. If there wasn't a phrase for it, we created one, and it's so funny. I was talking to a friend of mine about tithes and offerings, and he says, what do you call this in the Salvation Army? I said, tithes and offerings. He said, no, you guys got a phrase. I said, oh. I said, the envelope is your cartridge. And when you throw it in the offering plate, it's firing your cartridge. He was like, so he looked at me, that's so cool. I wish we would say stuff like that, and I'm like, anyway, that's my one. I think
this isn't a time to debate necessarily, but I think like my challenge is like when you get to a place where you always have to say, I'm the corps officer, which is like being a pastor, or like I've noticed a lot of like, social media from NHQ, IHQ will say things like, often it's putting things in parentheses. Mm-hmm. It's like, if we're having to put things in parentheses, maybe we've lost the opportunity to really create a new way of thinking about things, because let's just say what it is. But you and I, maybe we can have a podcast about that some other time. I don't disagree with leaning into our heritage and leaning into what we have. And certainly your book has done that for us really in a helpful way. And look, I just recommend people to take some time to read it. You'll see that it's really well documented. Like he did his research. He had that time during COVID to look into this. And it is important to see, I think, and I know we agree on this, Jason, like how God has led the institution that you and I have been a part of, for so long. And how it also should be encouraging the other movements too, other movements that we believe the Holy Spirit's active in, is that if God, the Holy Spirit is at work, he uses messed up people, he uses controversies, and even in the midst of like really challenging times, God is at work. So any last thing you want to say, Jason?
No, I buy the book. I get nothing out of it. So, I would love to get a note that said we have to do a second printing. That would be awesome to me. But it's an easy read. You can go through it. It's a friend of mine said it's fast moving, just like the early days of the Army, and that's exactly true. We were growing beyond what we even knew about at the time. And read it. Understand. Send me a note and ask me questions. I'll try to answer them the best I can.
Yeah, invite Jason in to come into. You could just do it via Zoom, or you could invite him to fly in and make a presentation to an advisory board or a corps or a youth group or any. I think it's just a fascinating story. We might as well tell this, even it kind of shows some of our warts, but it's worth sharing it and have him come in and share. I think it'd be a great thing. Jason, thanks so much for your time. Oh, I forgot the more to the story question. What's more to the story of Jason?
I don't know. I serve as a Salvation Army officer. So
come on.
I don't know.
What's something you like to do? What's something that people don't generally know about you?
I'm working on a few other things, but my time is really taken up here at my corps, doing corps officer duties as I'm not married. So I do everything here myself.
Yeah.
I love history. So I not only Army history, I love American history. So I get involved with some here in this area, Ohio. It's Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, Pioneer Days kind of thing.
There it is.
Which are fun, and
you dress up.
I do sometimes, and if you look at my Facebook page, you'll see me at Mount Vernon, where I served as a volunteer for a couple of years. So, and still do.
Did you play a character?
No, I was just a general person, helper. We would say, helper. The official term is wayfinder. I just love that. I would just stand on a corner and point people to the right direction, and that kind of thing. But I enjoyed it. It was fun. It was something out of my comfort zone to a point, and I miss it a lot. But I'm getting involved in some stuff around the area with a little bit different time frame, but it's still kind of fun.
That's great. Well, Jason, thanks so much for your time. It means a lot to me. Thanks for sharing the book. And remember, you can get your copy. So check that out with one of those ways that I offered earlier, where you can share a link, you can make a comment, or you can join an email list, and you can win an opportunity. You can get an opportunity to win a copy. Thanks so much, Jason. God bless you.
All right. Thank you, Mandy.